The Golden Lotus, the most luxurious restaurant in Manhattan's upscale neighborhood, was preparing for an influx of evening guests. Dahlia Page adjusted the impeccably ironed collar of her white blouse and checked her reflection in the mirrored surface of the bar once again. In her 20s, she looked a little older perhaps because of the severe hairstyle or the overly serious look in her brown eyes. James, the maitre d', gathered the staff for the traditional pre-shift briefing. Dahlia listened half-heartedly. She had already learned the intricacies of serving discerning guests in 6 months of employment. Working at the Golden Lotus helped pay for her second year of law school and gave her the opportunity to observe those who might become her clients in the future. At 8:30, the restaurant began to fill up. Dahlia maneuvered professionally between tables, managing to take orders, serve the food, and keep up a light conversation with the regulars. Around 9 o'clock, the maitre d' subtly beckoned to her. "Mr. Frost has arrived. Table number 7 is your area. Be especially attentive," he said softly. Dahlia nodded. She didn't know much about Lester Frost, owner of a chain of premium restaurants, including the Golden Lotus, a regular on the society circuit. She'd never seen him in person. The boss usually showed up at the restaurant on weekends when Dahlia had classes. A tall, gray-haired man in an impeccably tailored suit sat alone. As Dahlia approached the table, he looked up from the menu, and she froze involuntarily under the intense gaze of his light gray eyes. There was something hypnotic about him, commanding, and yet surprisingly soft. "Good evening, Mr. Frost. May I offer you an aperitif?" He smiled slightly, and the wrinkles in the corners of his eyes became more noticeable. "You must have worked here recently. I don't remember you." "6 months, sir. I usually work weekdays." "I see. What would you recommend from the new menu?" Dahlia began to talk about the seasonal specialties, noting to herself how attentively he was listening. There was something comforting about him, the elegance of his gestures, his soft voice with a slight huskiness, his ability to listen. All evening she felt his gaze on her. He took his time with dinner, sipped his wine slowly, occasionally making notes in his leather diary. When Dahlia brought the bill, he asked for compliments on the chef and left a generous tip. The next day, he showed up again, and the day after that. By the end of the week, the entire staff was whispering about the boss's unusual behavior. He usually visited each of his restaurants no more than once a month. On Friday, while serving dessert, Dahlia noticed a glossy magazine on the table. On the spread was an article about Lester Frost. King of the restaurant business celebrates 56th birthday. The photo didn't convey his charisma. He looked younger and more attractive in person. "Not a good picture," he said, as if reading her mind. "Dahlia, did I read your name correctly?" She touched her name tag absent-mindedly. "Yes, sir." "It's an unusual name, like a flower." "Mom loved dahlias and dahlias," she replied, and immediately regretted her candor. "Loved?" He gently emphasized the past tense. "Parents died 5 years ago." He was silent for a moment, then spoke softly. "I'm sorry, it must have been hard on you." There was genuine sympathy in his voice, and Dahlia felt the protective wall she'd carefully built up over the years crack. "I'm sorry, I have to work." She tried to smile and backed away from the table. She avoided his gaze for the rest of the evening, but she could feel his presence in her skin. When the last customers had dispersed, the maitre d' held out an envelope to her. From Mr. Frost. He asked that it be delivered personally into his hands. There was a note in the envelope written in sprawling handwriting. "Allow me to invite you to dinner. I promise I won't talk about sad things. If you agree, tomorrow night at 8 o'clock at La Maison, LF." Dahlia reread the note several times. An inner voice sounded in her head, warning against hasty decisions, but she already knew she would agree. Something told her this night would change her whole life. La Maison turned out to be a fine French restaurant overlooking the evening Central Park. Dahlia was nervous about choosing an outfit. Her closet consisted mostly of comfortable clothes for studying and work uniforms. In the end, she settled on a single deep blue cocktail dress she'd bought for prom. Lester was waiting for her at the entrance. He looked even more imposing than usual in his dark gray suit and off-white shirt. The doorman respectfully opened the door in front of them. The maitre d' escorted them to a table by the panoramic window. "I hope you like French food?" Lester helped her sit down and took the seat across from her. To be honest, I'm not very good at it, Dahlia decided to be frank. Then let me order for you. I promise it will be an unforgettable gastronomic experience. He turned out to be a great conversationalist. He told her about his travels, shared funny stories from his restaurant life, and asked about her studies with interest. Dahlia gradually relaxed, forgetting about the difference in age and social status. "Why law?" he asked when dessert was served. "I want to help people assert their rights. After my parents died, I was confronted with the bureaucratic machine and realized how important it is to know the laws." He looked at her carefully. "You're an amazing girl, Dahlia. At your age, one usually dreams of more frivolous things." "Life made me grow up," she shrugged. After dinner, he suggested a walk in the park. The October air was fresh and clear. They walked down an alley, and Lester told the story of the creation of his restaurant empire. "I started out as a simple cook, worked hard, studied hard, saved every penny. I opened my first restaurant when I was 30, a tiny place in a not-so-prestigious neighborhood. How many do you have now?" 23 in New York City and 37 more across the country. She whistled. "Impressive. I just know what I want and I know how to wait." He looked at her in a special way. The next day, a bouquet of white roses was delivered to the Golden Lotus. A day later, a box of exquisite French cakes. Then there was an invitation to the opera, a dinner at a Japanese restaurant, a boat ride on the Hudson. Dahlia noticed the interested looks of her colleagues, heard the whispers behind her back, but she didn't care. She enjoyed being with Lester, his attention, his care, his ability to make a holiday out of every meeting. One day, he picked her up after class in a luxurious silver Bentley. "I want to show you something," he smiled enigmatically. They drove to Brooklyn, stopping outside an old brick building. "This was my first restaurant here." Lester ran his hand along the rough wall. "It's a pizzeria now, but I come here sometimes, to remember where I started." Dahlia realized this was the first time he was showing her something personal, important to him. This was more than just a tour of the past. That evening, he kissed her for the first time, gently, almost weightlessly. His touch sent a shiver through her body, and Dahlia realized she was falling in love. Falling in love as quickly and without a second thought as one could only fall in one's 20s. Now every day began with a message from him and ended with a long phone call. It was as if she had fallen into a magical fairy tale, where every wish was granted at the wave of a magic wand. "You've changed," Sarah, a classmate, remarked, glowing from the inside out. Dahlia only smiled enigmatically. She wasn't ready to share her happiness. It seemed too fragile, too improbable. And Lester continued to surprise her. Tickets to private shows, jewelry, designer outfits. It was as if he was trying to make up for everything she had been deprived of in her youth. But the main gift was his attention, always sensitive, delicate, warming. She could not imagine her life without his calls, without their long conversations about everything in the world, without his special smile, intended only for her. The difference in age, which at first seemed like an abyss, was erased, dissolved in their common interests and outlook on life. When he offered her to leave her job at the restaurant, she agreed without hesitation. Now they could spend even more time together. Studying took a back seat. Dahlia knew it was wrong, but she couldn't help it. She fell in love with him anew every day, with his ability to listen, with the slight crinkles in the corners of his eyes when he laughed, with his quiet confidence, and his willingness to protect her from all adversity. Spring in New York was unusually warm. Central Park was drenched in cherry blossoms, and on Fifth Avenue the storefronts changed their winter decorations for bright spring compositions. For Dahlia, this spring was a time of discovery. Lester introduced her to a world she had only guessed existed before. Every evening they spent together became a special event. At the Metropolitan Opera House, they listened to La Traviata. Dahlia, who had never been to the opera before, was enchanted not only by the magnificent production, but also by the atmosphere itself. The velvet armchairs, the crystal chandeliers, the ornate audience. Everything seemed like the setting for a magical play where she played the lead role. "Do you like it?" whispered Lester, as they strolled through the foyer at intermission. "It's incredible, only a little sad, the story of Violetta." Every great opera has a tragedy in it. Maybe that's why they touch hearts so much. In Chelsea's art galleries, Lester showed her modern art, patiently explaining the concepts of abstract paintings. Dahlia learned to understand the language of colors and shapes, marveling at how her perception of the world was changing. One day, they spent an entire day at the Museum of Modern Art. Lester talked about artists with such passion that Dahlia asked, "Do you collect paintings?" "I have a small collection, mostly 20th century American artists. I'll show you someday." In the restaurants they went to for dinner, Dahlia now felt confident. She had learned to understand wines, could identify the cutlery for different dishes, and could hold a conversation about haute cuisine. Lester introduced her to the world of classical music. In Carnegie Hall, they listened to piano concerts. In Lincoln Center, the symphony orchestra. After each concert, they took long walks through the evening city, discussing what they had heard. "Music is a special language," Lester said. "It tells stories that cannot be put into words." One evening, he took her to a charity ball to benefit a children's hospital. Dahlia wore a long ivory dress that Lester had sent her the day before. In the Plaza Hotel's lavish ballroom, couples twirled, waiters served champagne, and jazz poured from the stage. "Shall we dance?" Lester held out his hand to her. They waltzed among the other couples, and Dahlia could feel the curious stares. She knew what these people were thinking. A young girl with a wealthy man much older than her. But she didn't care. After the ball, they sat in an all-night cafe, drinking hot chocolate and laughing, remembering the funny moments of the evening. Dahlia realized she had never felt so alive, so happy. Her world was expanding every day. Now she could tell the difference between Monet and Manet, knew the difference between Baroque and Rococo, understood the types of coffee and brands of cognac. But most importantly, she learned to see beauty in small things, to appreciate every moment, to enjoy life in all its manifestations. Lester was an attentive teacher. He never emphasized his superiority in knowledge or experience, did not rush her, did not impose his tastes. It was as if he were opening doors for her, giving her the right to decide for herself whether to enter them or not. Sometimes they spent evenings in his office in one of the restaurants. Lester worked on documents, and Dahlia read books from his extensive library. She loved these quiet hours filled with cozy silence and the aroma of coffee. It was at times like these that she felt especially keenly how much her life had changed over the past few months. It was as if from a black and white movie she got into a colored one, bright, rich, full of new impressions and discoveries. Spring was flying by fast, the trees in the park were covered with young foliage, tulips blossomed in the flower beds, and the air was filled with a premonition of something important and momentous. They often walked along the Hudson River embankment, admiring the sunset. Lester talked about his plans to expand his business, about new restaurant concepts, about countries he hadn't been to yet. "I want to show you Paris," he said. "It's especially beautiful in the spring. We'll walk around Montmartre, drink coffee in little cafes, look at the city from the top of the Eiffel Tower." Dahlia listened to him, holding her breath. There had never been a man in her life who had been so genuinely willing to share everything with her. Knowledge, experience, dreams. She had almost neglected her studies, appearing in class only to turn in the required papers strangely. Law seemed distant and unimportant to her. Her world had shrunk to the size of their common space with Lester, where there was no room for anything foreign. Every day brought new experiences. A helicopter ride over Manhattan, dinner on the roof of a skyscraper, a private screening of a new Broadway play. Lester knew how to surprise, showing with every gesture how important she was to him. And the city continued to bloom, filling the air with the sense of spring and the anticipation of happiness. This evening began as usual. Lester picked up Dahlia in his Bentley, and they drove to the Metropolitan Opera House for the premiere of Madame Butterfly. Dahlia was wearing a new dress the color of burgundy wine, a gift from Lester, perfectly emphasizing her fragile figure. Their seats were located in the center box. Before the performance in the lobby, Lester had introduced Dahlia to several important people from the world of art and business. She had already learned how to hold her own in such company, smile, make small talk, exude a confidence she didn't really feel. "You're gorgeous," Lester whispered as they took their seats. There was unconcealed pride in his voice. The first act flew by like an instant. At intermission, Lester led Dahlia not into the general foyer, but down some side hallway. "Where are we going?" she wondered. "I want to show you a special place." They climbed a narrow spiral staircase and found themselves on a small balcony with a stunning view of evening New York City. The lights of the skyscrapers glimmered in the darkness like a scattering of gems. "It's beautiful here," Dahlia exhaled. "I first came here 30 years ago." Lester leaned on the railing. "Back then I was a young cook and could only afford the cheapest galley tickets. But this is where I swore to myself that I would one day succeed." He turned to Dahlia. There was a new expression in his gaze, one of determination mixed with tenderness. "You know, I never believed in love at first sight. I thought it was the stuff of romantics. But when I saw you at the Golden Lotus, something shifted in my soul. It was like I'd been waiting all these years for you." He pulled an antique velvet box from his pocket. "This has been passed down in the Frost family for generations. My great-grandmother received it on her wedding day, then it passed to my grandmother, then to my mother." The box contained an amazing pearl necklace, 3 strands of large black pearls held together by a platinum diamond clasp. "Dahlia," Lester's voice trembled slightly. "Will you marry me?" It was as if time had stopped. Somewhere downstairs a bell was ringing, inviting the audience to the second act, but they didn't hear it. There was only the two of them, this balcony and the twinkling lights of the city. "Yes," Dahlia whispered. "Yes, of course, yes!" Lester gently clasped the necklace around her neck. The pearls were warm, as if alive. Dahlia touched them with her fingers, still not believing what was happening. "It's perfect for you." Lester kissed her. "It's like it was made for you." The second act they barely watched. Dahlia felt the pleasant weight of the pearls on her neck and thought about how amazingly her life had turned. A year ago, she was just an ordinary student, a part-time waitress, and now... After the play, they went to the Golden Lotus. Lester had arranged for a table to be set up in a separate office. Champagne, candles, fresh flowers, everything was perfect. "Here's to us," Lester raised his glass. "To our future." Dahlia smiled, admiring the play of light in the crystal. She felt light and calm, as if everything that was happening had been predetermined long ago. "When do you want to have the wedding?" Lester asked. "I don't care. I can have it tomorrow." He laughed. "No, such an event has to be organized perfectly. Give me a month." They talked until dawn. Lester talked about his mansion on Fifth Avenue, where they were to live, about their plans for the future, about places they would definitely go together. In the morning, Dahlia woke up in her small apartment, and the first thing she did was reach up to her neck. The pearl necklace was in place, so it wasn't a dream. She walked over to the mirror. A different Dahlia looked back at her, a happy, confident woman with a mysterious smile and gorgeous pearls around her neck. The doorbell rang. A courier brought a huge bouquet of white roses and a note. "Good morning, my bride. I can't wait to start our life together. Yours, L." Dahlia clutched the note to her chest. She didn't know it was possible to be this happy. There was a new life ahead of her, a life she had never dared to dream of. Outside the window, a new day was dawning, and the whole world seemed beautiful and full of possibilities. The Frost Mansion was a 4-story red brick building built in the early 20th century. The wrought iron gates, the small manicured garden, the white stone steps leading up to the massive oak door all breathed old money and impeccable taste. Lester had brought Dahlia to familiarize herself with the house on a sunny May morning. As they walked up the steps, the door swung open as if they were already expected. Standing on the threshold was a tall, thin woman in a strict gray dress. "Fiona, meet Dahlia, my fiancée," Lester pronounced. "Dahlia, this is Fiona Russell. She's been running all the affairs of the house for 15 years. The housekeeper bowed her head slightly. "Welcome, Miss Page." Her voice was as gray as her dress. Dahlia felt a chill run down her spine. The look in Fiona's light blue eyes seemed to shine through her. "Come on in. I'll show you the house." Fiona motioned forward, her heels clacking on the marble floor. The hall was impressive in size and elegance. Crystal chandelier, gilt-framed mirrors, antique mahogany furniture. A wide staircase with twisted banisters led to the second floor. Here's the living room. Fiona swung open the double doors. The spacious room was flooded with sunlight. Tall windows overlooked the garden. Beige walls were decorated with heavy framed paintings, and soft furnishings lent themselves to leisurely conversations. Dining room. The next room impressed with a long mahogany table and a collection of china behind glass sideboards. Library. Dahlia liked this room the best. Bookcases to the ceiling, leather armchairs, a fireplace with a bronze clock on a shelf. It smelled of leather bindings and wood. There's still Mr. Frost's study on the first floor, a small sitting room and a conservatory. Fiona's voice held an ill-concealed pride. They went up to the second floor. Here were the bedrooms, master, guest, and boudoir. Your bedroom, Miss Page. Fiona opened the door to a bright room overlooking the garden. Ours, Lester corrected gently. The housekeeper pressed her lips together but remained silent. The bedroom was done up in cream colors. A huge four-poster bed, a dressing table, a mirrored armoire, a cozy armchair by the window. A door led from the bedroom to a walk-in closet and a marble-topped bathroom. The third floor is taken up by staff quarters, Fiona continued. The fourth has a billiard room and home theater. The basement has a wine cellar, laundry room, and kitchen. The house is beautiful, Dahlia said sincerely. It requires care and an understanding of tradition. Something akin to a warning sounded in the housekeeper's voice. After the tour, they went down to the dining room where tea was served. Fiona was pouring it with impeccable grace, but Dahlia could feel the housekeeper watching her every move carefully. How do you like your cookies, Miss Page? A catch could be heard in the question. Delicious, is that your recipe? The recipe has been passed down in the Frost family for 4 generations. Fiona cast a quick glance at Lester. After tea, Lester got a business call and Dahlia was left alone with the housekeeper. Let me show you something else. Fiona led her into the library. She began to talk about the history of the house, the traditions of the Frost family, and how important it was to maintain a certain way of life. Her voice was full of poorly concealed pride mixed with admonishment. This house requires special treatment, Miss Page. Everything here has its own significance, its own history. Dahlia listened half listening, looking at the spines of the old books and trying to cope with the strange sense of unease that the housekeeper's gaze was causing. When they left, Fiona stood on the porch, straight as a string. I'll expect to see you in a week, Miss Page. We need to discuss the details of the move and the wedding. Don't mind her manners, Lester said as they got into the car. Fiona is devoted to the house and sometimes too zealous about tradition, but she's irreplaceable. Dahlia nodded, but a worm of doubt had already settled in her soul. There was something about this house, about this housekeeper, something unsettling, like a premonition of a thunderstorm on a cloudless day. But she pushed those thoughts away. After all, she would soon be Mrs. Frost, and this beautiful old house would be her home. And Fiona, well, she would have to learn to get along with the housekeeper. In the evening, lying in her small apartment, Dahlia imagined the huge rooms of the mansion, their future bedroom, the library. But for some reason, Fiona Russell's piercing gaze rose before her eyes, and her cold voice sounded in her ears. This house requires special treatment. Preparations for the wedding swirled Dahlia in a whirlwind of events. Lester had insisted that the ceremony be held at the mansion, a Frost family tradition. Fiona had taken on most of the organizational chores, which only increased the tension between the future mistress of the house and the housekeeper. Miss Page, the florists are waiting for your decision on the floral arrangements. Fiona placed a sample album in front of Dahlia. Although I would recommend white roses and lilies, a classic combination that never goes out of style. Dahlia turned the page. And I like peonies and orchids. As you wish. The housekeeper sounded poorly concealed disapproval in her voice, though it is somewhat modern for a house like this. Each day brought new worries. Choosing the menu, compiling the guest list, selecting musicians all required attention and decisions. Fiona was present at every discussion, inserting her comments and observations. Choosing a wedding dress was particularly difficult. Lester insisted on the best bridal salon in New York. Mr. Frost has asked me to accompany you, Fiona announced as she appeared at the salon. I have a great deal of experience in such matters. Dahlia tried on one dress after another, feeling the housekeeper's critical eye on her. Finally, she emerged in a simple white silk dress with open shoulders. "This is it," Dahlia exhaled, looking in the mirror. "Too plain," Fiona shook her head. "Such an important day calls for more." "This dress is perfect," came Lester's voice. He stood in the doorway, breaking the tradition of not seeing the bride in her wedding gown. "You're beautiful, darling." Fiona pressed her lips together but remained silent. The days flew by swiftly. Dahlia moved into the mansion gradually, getting used to her new home. Her belongings seemed out of place among the antique furniture and old paintings. "Let me help you organize your closet," Fiona offered. "There are certain standards." "Thank you, I can manage on my own," Dahlia replied firmly. In the evenings, when Lester stayed late at the restaurants, Dahlia wandered around the house, trying to get used to the creaking of old floorboards and the rustles behind the walls. Sometimes she caught Fiona wiping down the silverware or adjusting the curtains. The housekeeper always pretended not to notice her. A week before the wedding, the first gifts arrived. Fiona pedantically recorded each one in a special book. "I hope you'll write thank you notes according to all the rules," she remarked. "I've prepared samples." "I know how to write letters," Dahlia objected. "Of course you do." The housekeeper smiled her cold smile. "But there is a certain etiquette." The last days before the ceremony had turned into a kaleidoscope of fittings, meetings with organizers, and rehearsals. Fiona was everywhere, overseeing every little thing, every detail. "Miss Page, your pearl necklace needs to be cleaned before the ceremony," she said one evening. "I can take it right now." "No." Dahlia touched the pearls machine gently. "I'll take it to the jeweler myself." Something resembling irritation flashed in the housekeeper's eyes. On the eve of the wedding, Dahlia couldn't sleep. She stood at the window of her future bedroom, looking out over the nighttime city. Somewhere in the house there were footsteps. Fiona was checking everything before going to bed as usual. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Frost. Tomorrow this house would officially be her home. Dahlia touched the pearl necklace around her neck and took a deep breath. Somehow, instead of pre-wedding excitement, she felt strangely anxious. Footsteps sounded outside the door again, then it was silent. The house lurched in anticipation of tomorrow. The morning of the first day of June was cloudless. The Frost mansion was bustling with activity. Florists were finishing decorating the staircase with white peonies and orchids. Waiters were arranging champagne glasses. Musicians were tuning their instruments. Dahlia sat in front of the mirror in her bedroom while the stylist worked on her hair. Fiona appeared every 15 minutes, checking on the bride's readiness. "The ceremony is in 2 hours, Miss Page," she reminded her for the 10th time. "Guests will begin gathering in an hour." "I remember, Fiona." Dahlia tried to remain calm. When the stylist was finished, the housekeeper meticulously inspected the result. "Perhaps we should add more nail polish, just to make it perfect." "It's already perfect," Dahlia retorted. The wedding dress lay on the bed, simple and elegant, like a flowing waterfall of white silk. Nearby, a pearl necklace gleamed in a velvet box. Fiona held out her hands to the clasp. "Let me help." "No, thank you. I'll do it myself." The housekeeper's fingers froze in the air for a moment, then she lowered her hands. "As you wish." Dahlia put the necklace on in front of the mirror. 3 strands of black pearls lay perfectly on her collarbones, emphasizing the whiteness of her skin. By 11 o'clock, the house was filled with guests. Dahlia could hear the hum of voices from downstairs, the clinking of glasses, the soft music of a string quartet. Fiona was darting between floors, giving last orders. "Something's wrong with the flowers in the lobby, and the champagne needs to be chilled more. And where's the priest?" Her voice sounded increasingly strained. The guests were beginning to notice the housekeeper's strange behavior. "My dear is fussing too much," came a whisper from one of the older ladies to Dahlia. "And the way she looks at the bride." At noon, the ceremony began. Dahlia walked down the stairs, arm in arm with the dean of the law school. He had agreed to replace her father. Lester was waiting downstairs, elegant in a black tuxedo. Fiona stood off to the side, clutching the folder with the ceremonial plan so white, her knuckles turned white. As Dahlia passed by, The housekeeper twitched as if she wanted to say something, but held back. The ceremony was short and solemn. The priest spoke of love and fidelity. The guests furtively wiped away tears. The musicians played Mendelssohn. Dahlia could feel Fiona's gaze on her, intense, scrutinizing, almost hostile. After the exchange of rings, the reception began. Champagne flowed, waiters served delicious hors d'oeuvres, and guests congratulated the newlyweds. Fiona continued to control every detail, but her movements became abrupt, nervous. "Darling, is everything all right?" Lester whispered, noticing Dahlia watching the housekeeper. "Yes, of course," she smiled. "It's just that Fiona is kind of, today, strange." "She's always nervous at important events." Lester kissed her on the temple. "Don't mind her." The evening flew by unnoticed. There was dancing, toasts, cake cutting. Fiona grew increasingly pale, her hands visibly shaking as she gave orders to the staff. By midnight, the guests began to disperse. Dahlia felt pleasantly tired. She went up to the bedroom to change, intending to return to the remaining guests. Unbuttoning her pearl necklace, she saw Fiona's reflection in the mirror. The housekeeper stood in the doorway, looking at her with a strange, unblinking gaze. "Is something wrong, Fiona?" "No, ma'am. Everything is perfect." The last word sounded almost like a threat. Fiona turned and disappeared down the dark hallway. Dahlia shivered, though the room was warm. Something about the housekeeper's behavior was inexplicably unsettling. She put the pearl necklace in the velvet box and headed for the door. It was time to return to her guests, to her husband, to her new life. Music played in the house, voices were heard, but for some reason it seemed to Dahlia that she could hear someone's quiet footsteps behind her. The guests left after midnight. There was silence in the mansion, broken only by the sounds of cleaning. The servants were tidying up after the celebration. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Lester discovered that Dahlia had not returned to the living room. He went upstairs, but the bedroom was empty. An open velvet box containing a pearl necklace stood on the dressing table. "Dahlia?" His voice echoed down the hallway. Concerned, he began to circle the rooms one by one, guest bedrooms, boudoir, study. There was a light on in the library. He pushed open the heavy door and froze on the threshold. Dahlia lay on the floor between the bookcases, arms spread out like a broken doll. Her white dress seemed unnaturally bright in the dim light of the desk lamp. "God, no!" Lester rushed toward her, but it was too late. The marks of strangulation were clearly visible on her neck. Her face was frozen in an expression of surprise and horror, as if she didn't believe what was happening until the last second. The police arrived 15 minutes later. Behind them were two unremarkable, unmarked cars. Detectives Lawrence McCain and Drew Harper of Homicide climbed the steps of the mansion, showing their badges to the officer on duty. McCain was a tall man of about 45, with a keen eye and early gray in his dark hair. His partner Harper was younger, a trim brown-haired man with a military bearing. "Nobody out of the house," McCain ordered. "Gather all witnesses in the living room." The library turned into a crime scene. Forensics experts were taking pictures, dusting for prints, collecting evidence. Dahlia's body still lay on the floor, covered with a sheet. "Time of death is between 12 and 1 o'clock in the morning," the medical examiner reported. "Death was caused by strangulation, judging from the marks on the neck, by a thin object, possibly a cord or chain." Harper looked around the room, making notes. "There's little sign of a struggle. She knew her attacker." Everyone who had remained in the house had gathered in the living room. Lester, pale and shaken, Fiona, who kept a stony expression on her face, 3 waiters, the maid, and the driver. "Who was the last person to see Mrs. Frost?" McCain asked. "She went up to change her clothes about midnight," said Lester quietly. "Said she'd be back soon." "Bedroom's all untouched," Harper reported. "There's a jewelry box with a pearl necklace on the dressing table. Apparently after she changed her clothes, she headed for the library." McCain turned to Fiona. "Miss Russell, where were you at this time?" "Supervising the cleaning of the dining room," the housekeeper replied in an even voice. "You can ask the staff." The waiters confirmed her words, but something in Fiona's demeanor alerted McCain. He caught Harper's gaze. He noticed it too. We're going to need to look all over the house, McCain said, and interview everyone individually. The long investigation was beginning. Outside the windows, dawn was breaking, and in the library of the Frost mansion, forensic experts continued to work, trying to find the answer to the question, who killed the young bride on her wedding day, and why? No one noticed Fiona's hands trembling when the detectives mentioned the pearl necklace. Detectives McCain and Harper took over Lester's office for questioning. The first to be called in was the landlord himself. "Tell me about your wife." McCain opened a notebook. "We met 8 months ago at my restaurant. She was working as a waitress, going to law school. Smart, beautiful. I fell in love immediately." "Fast-paced relationship," Harper remarked. "When you meet the one and only person, why wait?" Lester ran his hand over his face. "She was so young, so full of life. Did she have any enemies? Someone who might have wished her harm?" "No. She was kind, open-minded. Everyone loved her." "Everyone?" McCain raised an eyebrow. "And what was the relationship like with the staff at the house?" Lester hesitated. "Fiona wasn't thrilled about our wedding, but she was just concerned about the traditions of the house." The housekeeper was called in next. Fiona entered the study, holding herself straight as a string. "Miss Russell, how long have you worked in this house?" 15 years, her voice sounded steady. "I came here when I was 29. "And all those years have been devoted to the Frost family?" "Absolutely." "So loyal that the new mistress seemed like a threat to you?" Fiona flinched slightly. "I don't know what you mean. The servant told me that you were in constant conflict with Mrs. Frost. Criticized her taste, her manners, her decisions." "I was only trying to maintain the standards of the house." McCain stepped forward. "Where were you between 12 and 1 o'clock in the morning?" "I already told you. Supervising the cleaning of the dining room." "All the time?" "Yes." "That's odd. The maid claims that around 1:30 you went up to the second floor." Fiona went pale. "I was checking to see if everything was all right." Meanwhile, forensics were examining the evidence. The pearl necklace was sent for examination. "Detective!" The examiner called Harper into the lab. "There are clear prints on the pearls. They belong to the housekeeper." "But she wasn't supposed to touch the necklace." Harper frowned. "Mrs. Frost took it off herself before she changed her clothes." McCain questioned the staff. The picture of the last hour of Dahlia's life was gradually becoming clearer. At 12 o'clock, she went up to change. At about 12:20, a maid saw Fiona coming up the stairs. At 1 o'clock, Lester discovered the body. "What made her go to the library?" McCain pondered. "And why pearls exactly?" They summoned Fiona again. "Miss Russell, can you explain why your fingerprints were found on the pearl necklace?" "Yeah, I was helping Mrs. Frost put it on this morning." "A lie," Harper said stiffly. "She refused your help. There are witnesses." Fiona was silent, clasping her hands in her lap. "You went upstairs when Mrs. Frost went to change, took the necklace from the jewelry box, followed her into the library." "No." "You hated her, young, beautiful, taking the place of mistress in a house to which you had given 15 years of your life." "You don't understand." Fiona's voice trembled. "Then explain." "Yeah, I loved him. All these years. And he brought this girl barely older than my daughter, if she had been worthy of him. But she didn't even realize what an honor she had been given. So you decided to kill her." "I just wanted to talk, to explain how important the traditions of this house are." She laughed, said things would change. "I didn't mean to. The necklace was in her hands. I didn't even realize how it happened." Fiona covered her face with her hands and burst into tears. McCain nodded to Harper. "Arrest her." As the housekeeper was being led away, she suddenly turned to Lester, who was standing in the hall. "I'm sorry. I meant well. For you. For the house." Lester turned away. By evening, the mansion was empty. Only the police tape on the library door and the pearl necklace in the evidence bag remained, a silent witness to the tragedy that had played out in the old house on Fifth Avenue. The interrogation room of the police station was cold. Fiona Russell sat at her desk, staring at one point. Detectives McCain and Harper took seats across from her. "Tell me from the beginning," McCain said softly. Fiona looked up, tired. reddened with tears. 15 years ago, I came to the Frost house, a young widow with a child, no particular prospects. Lester, Mr. Frost, gave me a job, a roof over my head, a chance to give my daughter an education. She was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. At first it was just gratitude, then admiration, his intelligence, his manners, his attitude toward people. He never made me feel like a mere servant. He was always attentive, kind. You fell in love with him, Harper stated. Yes, her voice trembled. Foolishly, hopelessly. I knew my place, never allowed myself even a hint of it. Just lived close by, took care of his home, his comfort. It gave my life meaning. And then Dahlia came along. The girl! Bitterness broke through Fiona's voice. Inexperienced, knowing nothing about life. I saw the way she looked at the house, as if it were a set in a movie. Everything was a game to her, trying on dresses, choosing colors, planning receptions. And you decided to get rid of her? No! I just wanted to talk, explain what it means to be the mistress of this house. When she went up to change, I followed her. The necklace was in the jewelry box, 3 strands of black pearls, the symbol of the Frost family. She didn't even realize its value. Fiona clenched her hands into fists. I found her in the library. She was standing by the window, so young, so beautiful. I started talking about tradition, about how important it was to keep the spirit of this house. She laughed, said it was all out of date, that she was going to change a lot of things. And you didn't stand for it. The pearls were in my hands. I don't even remember how I got behind her back. It took seconds. Then I returned the necklace to the jewelry box and went down to the dining room as if nothing had happened. 15 years of devotion turned to murder, McCain said quietly. I loved him. Fiona lifted tear-filled eyes. Loved this house, and she was going to ruin it with her youth, her carelessness. I couldn't let that happen. Do you realize what awaits you? Yes. She straightened, becoming again like the impeccable housekeeper she had been all these years. I have no regrets. At least the house will keep its traditions. The detectives glanced around. The story was as old as the world. Unrequited love, jealousy, murder, and the victim was a young bride whose only fault was that she dared to be happy. Fiona Russell, you are under arrest for the murder of Dahlia Frost, McCain said formally. As she was being led away, she turned around once more. Tell Mr. Frost. Tell him I did everything for him, just for him. The detectives stared at her in silence. Outside the window, a new day was dawning, and in the old mansion on Fifth Avenue still hovered the shadow of tragedy, a story of love, betrayal, and death worthy of Shakespeare's pen. The case was closed, but its echoes long stirred the minds of New York society, becoming yet another dark legend of the city that knows no dreams.